Chapter 6 of Napoleon I by Walter Geer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. 6. 1797. From Rivoli to Campo Formio. The last Austrian attempt to relieve Mantua was made in January 1797, and under the same commander. Alvinzi now concentrated his main force, about 30,000 men, and marched down the valley towards Verona, while at the same time two smaller columns threatened the lower Adige from Picenza and Padua. In his previous campaign Alvinzi had made his principal attack upon the French in the vicinity of Verona. This time he proposed to try a new plan. It was to advance with his main force, the Second Corps, from his headquarters in the Tyrol down the Adige upon Rivoli, while Provera with the First Corps advanced from his base at Bassano upon Verona and Lagnago. Accordingly, on the 10th of January, Alvinzi began to descend the Adige with 28,000 men, while Provera, having divided his corps of 17,000 men into two parts, marched upon Verona and Lagnago. Aside from the 10,000 soldiers under Serrurier who were besieging Mantua, Napoleon had only 32,000 men at his disposal. Informed that the Austrians were about to take the offensive, he hastened to Verona to await developments. On the 12th of January, Provera having approached Verona with one division, his force was attacked and defeated by the division of Masséna, nearly 1,000 Austrians being captured. The ease with which the Austrians were repulsed convinced Napoleon that Alvinzi was not making his main attack from this direction. The next afternoon he learned that Joubert was hard pressed and had been compelled to fall back upon Rivoli. Feeling that the main Austrian attack would be made down the Adige, Napoleon at once made his plans accordingly. He sent orders to Joubert to hold the plateau of Rivoli at all hazards, and set out with all of his forces for that point, which he himself reached by daybreak of the 14th. As you stand on the irregular shaped plateau of Rivoli on a winter day looking north, you see immediately before you the bold snow-clad height of Monte Baldo. On your right at the foot of the plateau runs the Adige, which has just emerged from the Tyrolese Alps, and continues its rapid course down to the plains of the Po. A good road runs along the left or east bank, and an inferior one along the right. 6 miles to the west is the broad expanse of Lake Garda, of which glimpses may be caught. Through the plain which surrounds the plateau, from north to south, runs a swift stream called the Tasso, which is bridged or fordable at a number of places. Parallel to the Adige comes down towards the plateau a long ridge terminating in the heights of San Marco. The Rivoli plateau makes a very strong defensive position. At about 10 o'clock on the night of the 13th of January, Joubert had given orders to retire from Rivoli, fearing to be overwhelmed by the Austrians. At this moment arrived the message from Bonaparte saying that he was on his way with reinforcements, and ordering him to hold the position. The falling weather had ceased, and it was a clear, cold, moonlight night when Bonaparte reached Joubert's headquarters, about 4 in the morning. Knowing the country well, he could easily divine the positions, and also the plans of the enemy by the widespread lights of their camp fires. The gorge by which the Adige breaks through the lowest foothills of the Alps to enter the lowlands has been famous since the earliest times. The river cuts through the mountains just before arriving opposite the plateau at Rivoli, flows past that town, and thence past Verona and Lagnago towards the sea. Alvinzi was marching by the two main roads which lie on opposite sides of the river. With a view of surrounding and capturing the French army before passing the mountains, he had divided his forces into 6 parts. One column, of about 5,000 men, was to descend the Adige along the road on the left bank of the river, while another column of 9,000 men should follow the road along the right bank, and ascend the heights to the plateau of Rivoli. 3 other columns were to pass over the mountain roads and attack the French front, while the 6th column, 4,000 strong, was to march around the western slope of Monte Baldo, and attack the French left and rear. An examination of the map will show that these 6 columns were all separated from each other by practically impassable barriers. Notwithstanding all these errors, if Alvinzi on the night of the 13th of January had gained possession of the plateau of Rivoli, he would still have had great chances of success. By an hour's march he could have reached a strong position for battle, where Napoleon with his inferior numbers would hardly have ventured to attack him. This was the crowning act of that series of errors which together caused the defeat at Rivoli, one of the worst ever experienced by Austrian arms. In his choice of the plateau of Rivoli for the battlefield, Napoleon displayed excellent judgment. He had previously passed through the place and realized the importance of the position. The faculty of seeing and remembering the features of a country which he traversed was one of the distinguishing peculiarities of Napoleon's mind. When Napoleon arrived at Rivoli just before daybreak, he saw the lights from the 6 Austrian camps and perceived that Alvinzi had separated his columns by impassable obstacles. In his front were 28,000 Austrians. He had only Joubert's division of 10,000 on the field, but Massena would soon be up with 8,000 more. At early dawn began the battle which was to settle the fate of Mantua. For some time the Austrians had the advantage, and the result was in suspense. But Napoleon soon restored order in the French ranks. Every successive attack of the Austrians was violently repulsed, and their right and centre fell back towards Monte Baldo in great confusion. The Austrian column which attempted to turn the plateau on the west was completely cut off by the reserves under Ray, and compelled to surrender. The whole Austrian army was soon in full retreat. The battle ended in the worst defeat and most complete rout which the imperial arms had thus far sustained. The army was pursued into the Tyrol, and 13,000 prisoners were captured in the next 2 days. Out of 28,000 Austrians, with whom Alvinzi began the battle, he had left on the night of the 16th but 13,000 soldiers. Thus ended the battle of Rivoli, which is considered to be one of Napoleon's greatest tactical victories. In the meantime, Provera, with about 8,000 Austrians, almost half of his corps, had forced the line of the Adige and crossed the river a few miles above Legnago. He then marched rapidly towards Mantua with Augereau in pursuit. He was twice attacked by the French, and on both occasions his losses were severe, but nevertheless on the morning of the 15th he finally appeared with 6,000 men before Mantua. Here he was held in check for a day and a night by the blockading French army, until Napoleon arrived with reinforcements. Immediately after the battle of Rivoli, Napoleon learned of this movement by Provera, and he started at once with Massena's division for Mantua. Although this division had been marching and fighting continuously for the last 24 hours, under Napoleon's direction it marched all night on the 14th, and the whole of the next day, and on the morning of the 16th was ready for battle in front of Mantua. The same men who 2 days before had marched by night from Verona, and had borne the brunt of the fight at Rivoli, now covered 30 miles in 48 hours. The next morning there was a general engagement on the road from Mantua to La Favorita, a country seat of the Duke, which gave its name to the battle. Provera attacked in front, while Wurmser sallied out from the fortress at the head of a strong force. The latter was thrown back into the town by Serrurier, who commanded the besiegers, while Provera was attacked by Victor, and so badly beaten that he was forced to surrender his entire force. In 4 days the army of Italy had fought 2 pitched battles; had taken 25,000 prisoners, including 3 general officers; had captured 20 standards and 60 pieces of artillery, and had killed or wounded 6,000 men. The short campaign of Rivoli was the turning point of the war, and decided the history of Europe for 20 years. In 10 months Napoleon had subdued Italy and humiliated the proudest empire on the continent. It is not wonderful that he should have said in after years, "My life began at Rivoli." Meanwhile, Wurmser at Mantua was in a critical condition. For days the garrison of 20,000 men had been living on horseflesh. The victories of Rivoli and La Favorita had destroyed their last hope, and Wurmser could hold out no longer. On the 2nd of February the starving garrison surrendered. Thus ended the 5th operation of the Italian campaign, in which Napoleon, with only 44,000 soldiers, had killed, wounded or captured nearly 43,000 Austrians. Mantua was in possession of the French, and Napoleon was at last complete master of Italy. In this dark hour of humiliation, Austria decided to make one more supreme effort to reconquer Italy. The young Archduke Charles, who had won great glory on the Rhine, was recalled to take command of the imperial forces, and prevent the French from advancing by the new open road to Vienna. This brother of the Emperor, then only 25 years of age, was in his day second only to Napoleon as a general. The Aulic Council ordered him into Friuli, a district of the Italian Alps on the borders of Venice, where the 6th Austrian army was to assemble. This force, unlike the others, was inferior in numbers to the French, who had been reinforced by the arrival of Bernadotte with 15,000 men. Charles, with the main Austrian army, was stationed on the upper reaches of the Tagliamento, through which ran the direct road to Vienna. An auxiliary force under Lusignan was to the westward on the Piave. Napoleon, with his strengthened forces, resolved to take the offensive before the contingent ordered from the Rhine should reach the camp of his foe. The campaign was not long, for the Austrian forces were inferior in every respect to the French. Masséna advanced by the Piave, captured part of the forces of Lusignan, and drove him northwards towards Belluno. Napoleon, leaving Joubert with 18,000 men to repress the Tyrol, marched rapidly to the Tagliamento, which he reached on the 16th of March, long before he was expected. During the following night the French forded the stream and took the Austrians by surprise. After a gallant fight of 3 hours, they retreated in good order. In the meantime, Masséna had advanced from the Tyrol and cut the most direct line of communication with the Austrian capital. Charles was therefore obliged to retreat due eastward into the valley of the Isonzo, behind the rushing river which he hoped would stop the French pursuit. The severe cold, however, had formed ice bridges in several places, where the French easily crossed. Masséna captured Tarvis, thus closing the route by which the detachment from the Rhine was to arrive. After seizing both Trieste and Fiume, the only harbors on the Austrian coast, Napoleon crossed the pass of Tarvis and entered Germany. At the end of the month of March, Charles, with his army reduced by a fourth, was beyond the river Mur on the road to Vienna. Joubert in the Tyrol had not been so successful. The whole country had risen against him, but after several severe engagements, he forced his way into the valley of the Drave, and marched down that river to join Napoleon. Under the circumstances, Napoleon, on the last day of March, addressed to Charles what he called a philosophical letter, suggesting a suspension of hostilities. "Brave soldiers," he said, "make war and desire peace. Has not this one lasted 6 years? Have we not killed enough men and inflicted enough evils on sorrowing humanity?" He continued his pursuit, however, and after the capture of Leoben on the 7th of April, was within 100 miles of the Austrian capital. Then at last the Imperial Cabinet decided to treat for peace. The dismay in Vienna had been great, and all preparations had been made for the flight of the Imperial family to Hungary. Among the fugitives was a little girl of 6 years named Marie Louise. Who would then have imagined that 13 years later this little Archduchess was to be the bride of the conqueror of Italy? The situation of Napoleon at Leoben was by no means secure, and he was glad to receive the Austrian plenipotentiaries. There was a revolutionary movement in Venice, and the Tyrol was aflame in his rear. Moreau had not crossed the Rhine as planned, and no help could be expected from that quarter. The peace party in Vienna, however, was too strong to be resisted, and the Government was glad to accept the offer of Napoleon. On the 18th of April the preliminaries were closed and adopted. According to these, France was to have Belgium and the line of the Rhine. Austria obtained the mainland of Venice, together with Istria and Dalmatia. When the terms of Leoben reached Paris, they were ratified as a matter of course, even though they had been negotiated by an unauthorized agent. One thing, however, the directors notified Bonaparte he must not do, namely to interfere further in the affairs of Venice. This order reached him on the 8th of May, but just a week before Venice, as an independent state, had ceased to exist. The events which had transpired in Venetia during this last campaign gave Napoleon a good excuse for his action. Just at the moment that the peace negotiations were being conducted, the inhabitants of the Venetian mainland rose against the invaders, and there were massacres of the French at Verona and elsewhere. According to the secret articles signed at Leoben, the city of Venice was to have retained its independence, but her actions could now be chastised by annihilation. Venice could in fact indemnify the Hapsburgs for the further cessions which France exacted from them elsewhere. When Napoleon first entered Milan after the battle of Lodi in May 1796, he occupied the palace of the Austrian Archduke. On the occasion of his next visit he went to live in the Serbelloni Palace on the Corso Venezia, a few squares behind the cathedral. The Serbelloni is far handsomer than the royal palace, and probably the most beautiful of all the palaces of Milan. Here Josephine was installed by Napoleon when she came on from Paris. During the first weeks of the campaign, Napoleon was continually urging Josephine to join him in Italy. Finally yielding to his demands, she left Paris for Milan the last week in June, 1796. Here she passed most of the summer, except for a short visit to headquarters before the battle of Castiglione. Having resumed the siege of Mantua after this victory, Napoleon went to Milan, where he passed a fortnight with his wife. The Austrians then began a new offensive, and he was obliged to rejoin his troops. While Bonaparte was gaining his victories, Josephine was bored to death at Milan. At this time she wrote a letter to her aunt Madame Renaudin, who had just married the Marquis de Beauharnais, the father of her first husband. This letter shows the feeling of sadness which oppressed Josephine, separated from her children and her Parisian friends. The Duc de Serbelloni, who was going to Paris, was charged with the delivery of this epistle, which ran as follows: "Monsieur Serbelloni will tell you, my dear aunt, of the manner in which I have been received in Italy. All the princes have given me fête, even the Grand Duke of Tuscany, the brother of the Emperor. Well, I prefer to be a simple private individual in France. I do not care for the honors of this country. I am much bored. It is true that my health contributes much to make me sad. I am often indisposed. If good fortune could assure good health, I ought to be well. I have the most amiable husband that a woman could hope for. I have no chance to desire anything. My wishes are his. All day long he is in a position of adoration before me, as if I were a divinity. I could not have a better husband. Monsieur Serbelloni will tell you how much I am loved. He often writes my children, of whom he is very fond. He is sending Hortense by Monsieur Serbelloni a beautiful enamelled repeating watch surrounded by fine pearls; to Eugène a handsome gold watch." Early in December, 2 weeks after the battle of Arcole, Napoleon was once more back in Milan. Lavalette, who had just been appointed aide de camp, gives in his "Memoirs" an interesting account of the life at the Serbelloni Palace. The aides de camp of Bonaparte were then 8 in number. Muiron, who had been killed at Arcole, and Murat, who had just been made a general, were no longer included in the number. The first aide de camp was Colonel Junot, afterwards Duc d'Abrantès, who had first attracted Napoleon's attention at Toulon by his bravery and natural wit. The second was the future Duc de Ragusa Marmont, colonel of artillery, who belonged to an old and highly considered family of Burgundy. He was a man of good education, of boundless ambition, and was deeply attached to his commander, whom he also had met for the first time at Toulon. Less brilliant than Junot and Marmont, but of a more stable character, was Duroc, the future Grand Maréchal du Palais, the devoted friend of Napoleon, who served in all the campaigns of the Empire until he was killed by his side at Bautzen in 1813. Among the other aides de camp were the young Louis Bonaparte, then just 18 years of age, and Lavalette, the future Directeur Général des Postes. The names of the remaining 3 never became known to fame. The 19th of February, a month after the battle of Rivoli, Bonaparte signed with the Pope the Treaty of Tolentino. He was then only 3 marches from the capital, and nothing could have been easier than for him to enter the Eternal City in triumph. He had the wisdom not to do so, and Rome was the only continental capital in which he never set foot. The same day Napoleon wrote Josephine his last letter during this first campaign of Italy. "Not a word from you! Bon Dieu! What have I done? To think only of you, to love only Josephine, to live only for my wife, to enjoy only the happiness of my loved one, do I merit on her part so rigorous a treatment? My beloved, I implore you, think often of me, and write me every day. You are ill, or you do not love me. Do you then think that my heart is of marble? Write me, think of me, and love me. Pour la vie à toi." It is a matter of regret that the letters of Josephine to her husband during this same period have not been preserved, but it is to be presumed from Napoleon's constant reproaches that she responded but rarely to his sentimental effusions. She did not hesitate to show his letters to her friends, saying with her funny Creole accent, "Est-il drôle, Bonaparte?" She was proud of him, she admired his glory, she was fascinated by his prestige, but she was not in love with him. If Napoleon later became less devoted, it was because he had not received that response to his tenderness which he had looked for. As Milan is one of the hottest places in Italy, during his second and last summer there, Napoleon left the heat of the city, and took up his residence at the lovely villa of Montebello, which is situated on the old Como road a few miles from the city. It was then a great country palace sitting far back from the high road in a large park with cool, shady avenues, pretty fountains, and all the exquisite loveliness of an Italian retreat. From the broad high terrace that ran around the front and sides of the villa, the Alps could be seen on one side, and the beautiful spires of the Milan Cathedral on the other. This beautiful villa is now a lunatic asylum. Here most of the members of his family rejoined him. Madame Bonaparte came with the desire of obtaining his approval of the marriage of her eldest daughter, Elisa. A suitor had presented himself in the person of Felix Bacciochi, of a poor but noble family of Genoa. Although his face was stupid and insignificant, he passed for a handsome man. The marriage had taken place at Marseilles the 1st of May, 1797, in spite of the formal opposition of Napoleon. It was to secure his pardon, and to persuade him to furnish a dot, that his mother now came to Milan. Napoleon finally gave his approval, and at the same time announced to his mother the marriage which he had arranged between Pauline and Leclerc. Pauline was then 16, and was extremely pretty, with a rare combination of beauty and grace. But she was an ignorant child who could hardly read or write. Leclerc was a handsome man of 24. He was small in stature, and although blond, bore some resemblance to Napoleon. Napoleon had first met him during the siege of Toulon. He had been attached to Napoleon's staff in Italy, and was highly esteemed by his commander. On the 14th of June the marriage was celebrated, with both civil and religious forms, by the express wish of Napoleon. At the same time he had blessed by the Church the civil union of Elisa and Bacciochi. 2 days later were signed the contracts, by which the two sisters each received from the three brothers, Joseph, Napoleon, and Louis, by way of dot, a capital of 40,000 francs, which was stated to be their share of the Bonaparte family property, which must therefore have reached a total of 320,000 francs. This family reunion, where there were so many elements of discord, was not prolonged. After a visit of 2 weeks, during which she was present at the two marriages, Madame Bonaparte left for Corsica. Elisa and her husband accompanied her. Joseph also left Montebello. He had been given a diplomatic post at Parma, but before he could go there to take up his duties he received a notice of his appointment as minister at Rome, with a salary of 60,000 francs in gold. He at once set out, taking with him his wife and his youngest sister, Caroline. On leaving Milan, Napoleon sent Jérôme back to college at Paris. Pauline remained in Italy with Leclerc, who had been named chief of staff in the army. What a change in the family fortunes in the short space of 2 years! Before the events of the 13 Vendémiaire, Napoleon was living in misery in Paris. Joseph was looking for a small consulship in Italy; Lucien for a small post in the commissary department; Louis was a student at Chalons. 2 years later, Napoleon is the commander in chief of the victorious army of Italy. Joseph is ambassador at Rome; Lucien is head of the commissary; Louis is captain of cavalry; the 2 girls are married and endowed; the mother has returned in sovereign state to Corsica, which had just been evacuated by the English. All of this is due to Napoleon; but there is not a single member of the family who is not seriously convinced that this good fortune is a tribute to his own merits. The blindness of Napoleon to the faults and weaknesses of his family is the feeble point of his mind, as it is also one of the most attractive sides of his heart. The 24th of June, 1797, Josephine again left Paris, and arrived at Montebello the 9th of July, where she spent several weeks. The early autumn of this year, which Napoleon and Josephine passed at the Serbelloni Palace in Milan, was perhaps the happiest period of their lives. the attention of Europe was more drawn to this palace than to all the residences of the emperors and kings. There the conqueror of Italy lived in regal style, surrounded by his military court. Beside him was Josephine, who already seemed like a sovereign. Bonaparte was then the favorite of the Milanese population, who waited for hours at the gates of the palace to see him come out. He was regarded by all the Italians as a fellow countryman, and this fact had contributed not a little to his success in Italy. At Milan, as later at Paris, Josephine admirably served the interests of her husband. By her antecedents, her relations, her character, she formed a connecting link between him and the personages of the Ancien Regime. "My marriage with Madame de Beauharnais," said Napoleon, "brought me in contact with a large element the cooperation of which was necessary in my system of fusion, one of the greatest principles of my administration, and one which specially characterized it. Without my wife I should never have been able to have any natural rapport with this party." The salon of the former Vicomtesse de Beauharnais in the Serbelloni Palace recalled the elegance and the traditions of the most brilliant circles of the Faubourg St. Germain. Josephine received the noble families of Milan with exquisite grace, and there reigned a kind of etiquette which contrasted in a singular manner with the democratic air of her husband. Josephine was then 34 years of age. Her dark and faded complexion was concealed by the rouge and powder which she employed with consummate art. She was adroit in hiding the imperfections of nature. The elegance of her form, the grace of her movements, the softness of her eyes, and the tone of her voice, all the harmony of her person, gave to her an exceptional charm. Add to this a Creole coquetry which was all the more agreeable because it seemed natural and involuntary, a conversation which pleased without ever being pretentious, a kindness of heart which was manifested on every occasion, manners which recalled the best traditions of the court of Versailles, an exquisite taste in dress, with toilettes which queens might have envied, and you can easily understand the charm which a woman so eminently fascinating exercised over the heart and mind of Bonaparte. In order to understand Bonaparte's share in the coup d'état of 18 Fructidor, it is necessary to review briefly the course of political events at Paris. At the time of the adoption of the new Constitution, it was generally thought that the Revolution was entirely a thing of the past. But soon Royalist revolts broke out in the West, and there was a communistic plot at Paris for the overthrow of the Directors. The Royalists began to gain ground. The elections for the renewal of a third part of the councils resulted in large gains for them, and they succeeded in electing to the Directory a constitutional Royalist, Barthélemy. Another Director, Carnot, also favored moderate opinions. A crisis rapidly developed between the Jacobin majority in the Directory and the two legislative councils in each of which the Royalists had the majority. The chief reliance of the Royalists was in Pichegru, the conqueror of Holland, a former Jacobin, who had now given his adhesion to the Royalist party. That their intrigues aimed at the restoration of the Bourbons has clearly been proved. Matters came to a crisis in July, when the majority of the Council sought to force on the Directory ministers who would favor Royalist aims. Barras and two other directors refused to listen to these behests, and this defiance of the deputies was received with acclaim by the army, but was not satisfactory to most civilians. Under these circumstances, Bonaparte's conduct was very cautious and reserved. In the month of May he sent to Paris his most trusted aide de camp, Lavalette, with instructions to keep aloof from entanglements and to report to him on the state of affairs. The last of July he sent to the directors a brief note stating that Augereau had requested leave to go to Paris, where his affairs call him. The double rôle which Bonaparte was playing was plainly shown in these preparations. His official envoy to Paris was the Jacobin general, the child of the Faubourg, Augereau, while his secret envoy to the capital was Lavalette, a man in whom he had complete confidence, whose manners and social relations were those of the Ancien Regime. Through Augereau he aimed to keep in touch with the Republicans; through Lavalette with the Royalists. Already he had in view that system of fusion which was to be the basis of his internal policy. His plan was to take advantage of the consequences of the coup d'état, and at the same time to appear clear of any complicity in the movement. Augereau was certain to act with energy, and so it turned out. he prepared to end matters by a single blow. When the time came, he occupied the strategic points of the capital, drew a cordon of troops around the Tuileries where the Councils sat, invaded the chambers of the deputies, and consigned to the Temple the Royalists there present, with their leader, Pichegru. Barthélemy was also seized, but Carnot, warned by a friend, fled during the early hours of this eventful day, 18 Fructidor, or the 4th of September. The remaining members of the Councils now passed severe laws which entrusted the Directory with extensive and almost absolute powers. Augereau fully expected that he would be one of the two directors to be elected in place of Carnot and Barthélemy, but to his great disappointment he was not chosen. While these events were happening at Paris, the negotiations with Austria had dragged on slowly through the whole summer and far into the autumn of 1797, mainly owing to the hopes of the Emperor that the disorder in France would result to his advantage. Such might have been the case had not Bonaparte, while striking down the Royalists at Paris through his lieutenant, retained his victorious army in Venetia, ready again to invade Austria should occasion arise. The coup d'état of Fructidor helped on the progress of the negotiations. That event seemed to render impossible, at least for the present, the return of the Royalists. Towards the middle of September, 1797, Bonaparte, accompanied by his wife, took up his residence in the Château of Passeriano, to bring to a close the diplomatic negotiations with Austria. This residence was a fine country house situated upon the left bank of the Tagliamento, about 4 leagues from Udine. The negotiations, which had been dragging along for months, had reached a point where it was necessary to conclude or break them off. On the 16th of October he had a decisive interview with the Austrian plenipotentiaries. It seemed impossible to reach an agreement. Arising from his seat and stamping his foot on the floor, Bonaparte exclaimed: "You wish war? Very well, you shall have it." Then, seizing a magnificent porcelain liqueur set, Cabaret, he threw it with all his force on the floor, where it broke into 1,000 fragments. "Look!" he cried. "Such will be your Austrian monarchy before 3 months have elapsed." Then he rushed from the room. On leaving the conference chamber he gave orders to notify the Archduke Charles of the resumption of hostilities, after a delay of 24 hours. The following day the peace of Campo Formio was signed. It bore the name of a village situated half way between Udine and Passeriano. The principal articles of the treaty may be thus summarized. Austria ceded to the French Republic Belgium and the left bank of the Rhine. Of the once extensive Venetian possessions, France gained the Ionian Isles, while Austria acquired Istria, Dalmatia, the city of Venice, and the mainland of Venetia as far west as Lake Garda, the Adige, and the lower part of the river Po. At the news of the peace of Campo Formio great joy reigned all over France. 100 newspaper articles and numerous contemporary letters show us a nation drunk with happiness. On every side the praises of General Bonaparte resounded. It was a tremendous explosion of enthusiasm and affection. From the remotest country places to the faubourgs of Paris it ran like a lighted train of gunpowder. The French nation literally loved Bonaparte. It made for itself an ideal picture of the hero who had brought it peace. The affection of the country crowned him with all the virtues, and attributed to him valor, wisdom, and magnanimity. The Directory alone was uneasy. It tried to keep the hero away from the capital. But Paris was set on beholding its god, and the directors were forced to send for him. Leaving Josephine in Italy, a month later Bonaparte left Milan for Paris, traveling by way of Geneva, where he stopped for a day. He was accompanied by his aides de camp, Marmont, Duroc, and Lavalette, as well as his secretary, Bourrienne, and his physician, Yvan. The journey was a series of ovations. At Berne and at Bâle, and in all the cities through which he passed, he was received with salvos of artillery. He finally reached Paris the evening of the 5th of December. Napoleon took up his residence in the little hotel of the Rue Chantraine, from which he had set out 21 months before as an obscure man, to which he returned as a celebrity. One of his first visitors was Talleyrand, the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, who came at once to pay his respects. His interview with the directors was most cordial. To see Bonaparte, to talk with him, was the ambition of every one. The papers recounted the smallest details of his life. You can read in the Moniteur of the 10th December: "General Bonaparte is living in his wife's house, Rue Chantraine. This mansion is simple and plain. He goes out rarely, and without escort, in a simple carriage with 2 horses. He is often seen walking alone in his modest garden." Understanding the Parisian character, and knowing that the attention of the great capital is not long drawn to the same object, Bonaparte kept himself studiously in seclusion. He affected a simplicity which contrasted strongly with his glory. As soon as Bonaparte returned to Paris, Talleyrand, who desired to win his favor, wished to give a large fête in his honor, but awaited the return of Josephine. She finally reached Paris on the 2nd of January, 1798, and the ball took place the next night. The Minister of Foreign Affairs was installed in a new and sumptuous hotel in the Faubourg St. Germain. It was situated in the Rue du Bac, at the corner of the Rue de Grenelle. To review the life of Talleyrand, who was destined to achieve the greatest diplomatic reputation of the age, would be to recount the history of the Revolution. After taking a prominent part in the Fête de la Fédération, the 14th of July, 1790, Talleyrand remained in Paris until the day after the September massacres, when he obtained a passport for England. After a residence of over a year in London, at the beginning of 1794, he was expelled under the provisions of the Alien Act. He embarked for the United States, where he awaited events. An interesting account of his stay in America is given in the "Recollections" of the Marquise de la Tour du Pin. After the death of Robespierre, he made an attempt to secure permission to return to France. Finally, in September, 1795, his request was granted. On his return to Paris, early in the following year, he had a cordial reception. Through the efforts of Madame de Staël, who was then all powerful with Benjamin Constant, he was made minister in July, 1797. He immediately announced his appointment in a flattering letter to the conqueror of Italy, the man of the future, whose good graces he wished to secure. The fête to Bonaparte was a great success. The minister did the honors in an admirable manner. He loved display and etiquette. He had that cold politeness, that nonchalance doublée de malice, that exquisite tact, that science of the nuances, which distinguished the men of the Ancien Régime. He brought into the New World the manners of the court of Versailles. This ball, given by a former bishop, in an aristocratic mansion, was a sign of the times. Every one was tired of the rigors of the Revolution. All welcomed a return to the beaux jours de Marie Antoinette. During the 2 years that Napoleon had commanded in Italy, he had filled the world with the éclat of his victories. The coalition had been dissolved, and Austria had formally recognized the French Republic. 2 new republics like the French had been created, and all Italy had submitted to French laws and influence. The victories in Italy had caused alarm in Vienna, and forced the Aulic Council to recall 60,000 men from the Rhine, and thus enabled Moreau and Jourdan to resume the offensive, and carry the tricolor to the heart of Germany. More than 100 millions of francs had been levied in Italy, one half of which had supported the army, while the other half, transmitted to Paris, had been used for the expenses of the government and the support of the armies on the Rhine. The Louvre had been enriched by the masterpieces from the galleries of Parma, Florence, and Rome, which were valued at more than 200 millions. Happy days seemed assured for France, and for these she was indebted to the conqueror of Italy. Chapter 7.